Welcome to the Spin Room, where it's all spin all the time. This hour we have a panel of experts who are going to talk about technology. It's the Technology Hour. So my first guest is Casey Ream, who's an architect and faculty here and teaches in the Design and Technology program. Welcome, Casey. So welcome, Casey. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the different ways that technology is being used at SCI-Arc.
Sure. I think that if you compare the way that we view technology in the pedagogy here now to maybe the past maybe 15, 20 years ago, there's a quality to the pervasiveness of a lot of the digital techniques that kind of dominated for a while the design discourse. So now it's a much more kind of pluralistic approach to these things, because a lot of if we even just we're talking about kind of digital stuff, like it's totally ubiquitous and pervasive in our lives, right? You can't really isolate the way that we inhabit the world now from technology. So that question becomes much more open-ended about what does that impact mean on architecture. Like, it's not like a kind of inherent aesthetic to it. Potentially, like I think we saw in some of the kind of the 90s Columbia work, right? The kind of NURBS curve, swoopiness. Like technology now could be the way students are using kind of interactive game engines to explore kind of event within their architecture. Students making like Twitter bots and stuff. I have some students that made a AI astrologer that's got a blog going. I don't know if that's necessarily architectural, but it's part of the kind of milieu of things that are happening here. Like people trying to think through the way like our lives are kind of interfaced with, manipulated, and transformed through the kind of different modes of technology that are part of contemporary society.
Yeah. So it's less about digital tools and maybe more about digital space as a place that
there's still a lot of tools, but I think also we've reached a point with the culture here. I mean, there are introductory courses where you have to kind of get the ball rolling, but the students in a lot of ways are kind of finding stuff well beyond our scope. Like there's a very proactive nature to more find the tools that you need to start to execute the projects, and then of course like anything you interface with is also going to kind of change the way you think about something. But there's much less of a kind of singular pedagogic, you're going to learn this software and make this type of project. It's more go get some stuff that you need. Yeah.
What are some of the ways that you're using AI in the Design and Technology program?
A couple of different ways. We are using it for kind of producing image, ideas about kind of forms and aesthetics of architecture. We're using it to work with kind of automated fabrication and construction down in the robot house, looking at kind of laminated assemblies, using AI to govern how wood structures could be produced. We're using it to automate tasks a lot. Actually within that program particularly, a thing that emerged this year was a lot of the neural net techniques, which is a kind of form of AI. It's generally what people think of it. When the people say AI right now, they kind of mean neural net, even though it's not really the same thing. But that's become just an automation tool. So like a pair of students using AI to generate 20 stories of plans within an irregular building shape, and the structural columns and the floor slabs and the ceilings autonomously in like 2 days, because they wanted to change their project like kind of overnight. So yeah, it's operating that way too, just kind of more this kind of pure automation, speed and kind of intelligence side of it.
Cool. Well, we have some other guests we should welcome. We have, maybe you can introduce our guests.
We're joined by Ellie Abrams, who that's you, who is from University of Michigan, and Damjan Jovanovic, who also teaches here at SCI-Arc. In some of the different programs.
Hi.
Hello. So welcome to the Technology Hour. I was wondering, Damjan, maybe you could talk a bit about your work here as well in technology and what it means.
Well, I work more with people than with software. So I'm interested in constructing a new kind of an architect that is kind of partnered with technology, but not necessarily driven by technology, which is something I think we see mostly in today's practices of authorship, in architecture. We see these huge companies delivering software platforms, and then we see people actually kind of just using them. I'm interested in producing a new kind of architect that can make her own platforms for design and invent new ways of working and of creating. So this is the core of that idea. So it's more about automating design procedures than it's about somehow producing final results or producing legible architectures, you know.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is worth highlighting or noting is that there's some ways in which there's no conversation about architecture that happens today that is not already all about technology. So to kind of pull it out as its own topic is maybe an interesting thing to think about. And this shift that I think both Casey and Damjan referred to from thinking about the computer as a kind of discrete object and thinking about, let's say, the digital like as a kind of topic or as a set of techniques. The shift from that into like computation, network, pervasive, ubiquitous, digitality, and the idea that there's like all life and all design and the world in which we live is kind of infused with this. And so I think one thing that architects and architecture is trying to figure out is where we have inroads or agency or where we can kind of work in that culture and in that society.
And where do you see this heading, let's say specifically from an AI perspective? And do you think this is going to be something that displaces the way we work in a significant way, or is it going to augment the way we work? Or how do you see that playing out as a political project?
I mean, I think definitely there will be some displacement, and I think that there are certain aspects, particularly when you get into like larger offices, that I think that there could be a pretty clear cost benefit to automating certain tasks, like improving your overhead on things from anything that's kind of fairly repetitive. For example, like feasibility studies or is there thunder? Yeah, a train.
Somebody's thesis project.
Yeah, that's probably what it is.
Most likely.
So yeah, I think there's that side of it, and then also I think what we're seeing too is like companies that we maybe don't think of as being architecture companies are now operating within at least a professional territory, probably also social territory that kind of used to be our purview. Like I kind of think of firms like WeWork and Katera, which are very different firms, but are both kind of occupying that professional space and cultural space of that architecture used to have kind of control over. They have different agendas, so I think that also is going to shape how this stuff impacts our field, and our field's going to have to respond to it.
Yeah, that's a big question that I've had too, is like what does it mean that the most visible at least, but I think it's also the most significant speculation on how technology is going to change, let's say, cities or the way we live, is happening from these tech companies. People like WeWork, even Uber is sponsoring competitions with serious architects to design right. Drone hubs, and almost all of this stuff is being sponsored by SpaceX and these kind of private libertarian.
I think this is something we've seen in the 80s already with the advent of like design software, where all the tropes and all the mechanisms of use that we now know were invented by engineers and kind of put forward. The idea of user interface, for example, and how user interface is made and how it's actually deployed, right? It was invented by engineers, and I think this is something that we are trying to work on, is to win a little bit of that territory back and speculate on ways of how this new technology we can be part of the discussion from the beginning, right? Not be victims of it and then have to again invent ways of kind of just undermining it, because this classical idea of always architecture having to undermine technology, I think it doesn't need to be like that anymore, because after 30 years of the advent of the digital and the internet, I think now everyone can actually do that from ground up, right? Like build their own idea of how to work. I think this is related to this idea of AI, because AI will, I think, erase most of the classical means of evaluating projects, plans and sections and things that we understand, because I think these procedures will become automated at some point. And I think new representational techniques will be invented to just overcome what we now know. And that's something I certainly want to kind of work on.
In the future, in a kind of automated future like that, what do you think the role of us as designers becomes?
I think we need to construct new roles and new personas, new ways of, and new authorship ways, new engagements, new audiences too. I'm not sure how to exactly do that right now, but I think it's a beginning of that process. And that's, I think Casey was talking about artificial intelligence and game engines and these new tools that we are trying to deploy as means of just speculating on other options of how architecture is designed. I think that's just the beginning of that. Yeah.
I don't think that architecture is as static a profession as we like to think of it. I mean, it's certainly changed a lot in the last 100 years, right? I mean, it really was only formalized like late 19th century. Like for example, my father is an industrial architect, and worked at a very large E&A firm, and by the end of the 80s, they were fully digital, right? Like everything was in CAD. And that's kind of going to what Damjan is speaking of, that this stuff comes from, it first got implemented in territories where there's that kind of capital that allows for the investment in it and the investment and the change in the workflow. And I think in that case, it wasn't really until that paperless studio in Columbia that it was actually tried to be approached as a cultural project. I think what we see now is because I think generations are kind of much flatter and shorter now, kind of discursively and pedagogically, that we're not going to be waiting that long. I think like already in our school we're engaging stuff that is still at the kind of edge of what's being put into practice by like the kind of large tech companies and engineering firms.
What are some of the experiments you're doing here? Are there industry experiments? I know at Michigan there are some industrial partnerships. Are there industry partnerships, do you think, at every school?
Sure.
And do you think this is a good thing?
I think as long as you're aware of what everybody's motivations are for the partnership and how it can be a positive thing for both sides. Like you can't be naive and think that this money comes without strings and stuff. But at the same time, I think especially for a school like SCI-Arc, which is it's great as an architecture school, but it's also only an architecture school largely. Like there aren't other departments and things. Like actually having any kind of third-party participation can help reshape the way we're thinking about things, so it doesn't become so much of a bubble. So I think in that sense it's good. Like the project we did, Benjamin Bratt and I are working on with the Google AMI group. A lot of the stuff that's come out of that has led into like what we ended up doing in the seminars and studios within the master's program. So I actually think we probably got a lot more out of that than they did, at least so far. We'll see. Yeah.
I think thinking about the role of technology in architectural education today is a really interesting and kind of like urgent conversation that needs to be happening, because I think, again, like there was a time when we taught to a particular piece of software or to a set of techniques, and I think you began by saying, Casey, that that's no longer the case, and often students are coming actually with things, outside our purview or outside our expertise, right? And they're bringing those to the table, and that's like incredibly exciting. I think one thing I've been thinking about lately is how to make sure that students are also learning kind of digital literacy and digital ethics to a certain extent, like understanding the kind of consequences and issues surrounding the types of technology that they engage, whether it's software or hardware or what. And maybe another shift that I think has happened, it's not that it maybe is beginning, it already happened, I guess, but that's interesting, is one from a kind of individuality to like a collectivity or a social experience.
Right.
And so those two things are at least in my institution and my teaching, like that I'm trying to kind of think about in terms of just fundamentals of architectural education these days.
Yes, I think particularly when it comes to software, most of the classical software that we know kind of inherits that history of an individual author being exposed to that kind of frame where he's constructing the world. And I think we are moving away from that model into something more collaborative and something also that includes collaborations with non-human, so to say, entities like other intelligences. And I think that's exciting because that's the possible new model for also pedagogy and how we teach things, you know.
Well, it's probably, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just thinking, like, if I were to kind of, like, everything is kind of ephemeral right now. These experiments or these kind of collective aesthetic projects emerge here pretty quickly at the school. But like one thing that's I think that is actually a product of a lot of the new technology that is kind of getting deployed right now, particularly in terms of vision, is the sampling project. And also, I think that also plays into the kind of collective project, like the kind of getting assets from the game store, go scanning stuff. Yeah. And actually, if I think back, like you guys in particular, you and Adam had the projects where you're doing the kind of photogrammetry rocks and really exposing the artificiality of that thing. I think that's a kind of new thing. Like everything has kind of gotten completely like reality. Like there's the difference between abstraction, simulation, the kind of hyper-real, the kind of real versus fake thing. It seems to be kind of incredibly, it's collapsing and incredibly seductive right now for people in terms of their thinking and their design.
And this is reflected in the work. When I see students working in the studio, you see usually 3 screens with 10 different windows and everything playing at the same time. So I think this kind of collapse is really interesting because that's the new representational space that we're talking about. So it's not about legibility and clarity anymore. It becomes more about this kind of enormous amount of stuff that come from different aesthetics, and they all coexist in the same space. And I think that's maybe the contemporary moment a little bit.
And it probably relates a bit to what Ellie was saying about kind of new attitudes. I mean, maybe we're not like, there's like another generation, the Zoomers after us that are coming into college, and it makes me wonder, like, yeah, I think we're like the 30-year-old boomers now, and so there's like this new, maybe these younger students are now using technologies, social media in a different way. I've heard that there's kind of like people who analyze these things say that generation is using social media more as a kind of collaborative place and less as like that millennials would use it as like a self-expression. It's like my profile, my personal brand, everything's like my thing. I develop my own brand, and that this younger generation now is using. They've never even known what it was like to not have social media. So to them it's a place that they just hang out with their friends, and so maybe that is a bit what you're talking about, and how they use technology or how they want to use technology.
Yeah, I think that's one aspect of it, and I think the other is what Damjan was saying about authorship and about, I guess, the kind of the ambiguity of authorship, right? Or what Casey was saying about sampling. So, like in the face of this incredible amount of information that you can pull from, kind of where is your agency or to act, or kind of in what ways do you shape the thing that you're working on? And I think often it happens like in a more social environment where those things are being collectively shaped. And so there is no kind of sole claim to authorship, let's say, or originality maybe. Which I think is great. Which I think is a good thing. I'm not lamenting the loss of that. I think it's really exciting.
If you had to ask one question about sort of the future of technology, what would it be? What do you think the most important question is?
To quote from Elon Musk, what is outside of the simulation? No, that's not. That's like.
What do you think the most important issue is today? Like, what do you think the thing that's most pressing?
I'm going to say that I think the most urgent, pressing issue is how to dispel the myth that technology is neutral, and to ensure that people understand that it carries all the kind of biases and prejudices that we do as a society, and to kind of figure out ways for technology then to kind of do better than it is. I think it's actually, there are a lot of instances when it's quite damaging, but we're not fully aware of that because there's this assumption that it's kind of not shaped by our hands and therefore can't kind of carry on our biases. I think figuring out how to resist that and change that feels really urgent to me.
I would just continue the same line of thought. For me, it's the kind of the promotion of the right kind of biases, because there is never a transparent model, and there will always be kind of embedded default within technology that we cannot change, or we can resist through some kind of a Luddite or something that is even a conceptual project. But I think to promote right kind of bias, I think is maybe interesting as an idea, because it's a construction of a new kind of project in that. So that's what I would say.
I just want to, make it clear to our future robot overlords that I'm on their team, so that when they do take over, they'll at least put me in a comfortable pod. That's my goal in this whole thing.
When you said that earlier you were training an AI, and that you think of it as your intern.
Yeah.
So we're sort of in that's where we're at now. So in 40 years, he's going to be the CEO. And
I'm pretty low EQ, so like relating to an intern or a computer is pretty much the same for me. So that's not a good generalizable quality.
I don't think you should say that.
I shouldn't. Is this live?
Scratch that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, it'd be a great time to say thank you to our guests for joining us. This was the tech room, which is when the spin room is all about technology. And we'll be taking about a 20-minute break here, and we'll be back with the political hour. So thanks for spinning with us.